Hello, and welcome to the very first tutorial for operating the virtual Sikorsky S-92 for X-Plane. The S-92 has some unique qualities and flight characteristics that we'll cover today, and we'll also review some techniques that can help maximize your helicopter flying experience in X-Plane. First of all, if you start each flight with engines running, which is an option in the Operations and Warnings menu, then the aircraft will be essentially flight ready as soon as it loads. However, I suggest trying to start the aircraft without engines running at least once or twice to see what that process looks and sounds like. So for now, let's uncheck this box. Okay, so now we've opened the aircraft and all of the systems are off. You definitely want to be in the 3D cockpit for the engine startup, and most of the time the 3D cockpit is actually the best place to be in terms of being able to see all of the instruments and things that you want to see while you're flying. The 2D cockpit is really just limited to being there to make instrument flying and operating the autopilot easier. It's really limited in what it can do as far as controlling all the aircraft systems. So definitely, especially for the engine start process, you want to be in the 3D cockpit. If you do this at night and enter the 3D cockpit, you'll notice that it's completely dark and you can't see anything. What you can do is in X-Plane 9 and in 10, you can turn on night vision, which is a choice under the view menu. And in X-Plane 10, there's a new feature called the aviation flashlight, which currently doesn't work with my beta version. I'm running beta version 8 right now in version 10, so it's not working. But in any case, you need to be able to see the buttons in order to start turning things on when you're doing this at night. Okay. Back to daytime. So there's a checklist in the 3D cockpit that's located kind of close to where your knees would be. What you can do is if you have a key or joystick button assigned to spoilers, you can push that and it will bring the checklist up. Or what you can also do is just roll the mouse over to the checklist itself and you can click on it and it will pop out of its pouch and come into a decent position where you can actually read what's on it. First thing you want to do is to start the battery. So again, if you're doing this at night, once you turn the battery on, everything should light up and then it's easier to see what you're doing. You really only need the night vision or the aviation flashlight to find the battery switch. There's a panel with dimmers that allow you to adjust the brightness of the overhead panel, the side communications panel. There's a cockpit floodlight. You can also control the brightness of the primary flight displays and multifunction displays, as well as the radios and the autopilot screen. So really just what you want to do is set the lights to a position where it's comfortable and carry on from there. So the next thing to do is to start the auxiliary power unit. And what that is a small turbine engine it's located on the top side of the aircraft, and basically what this little engine does is provides power both through its generators and through bleed air, which draws compressed air out of the compressor to provide both electricity and to help start your engines. The main engines won't start without bleed air from the auxiliary power unit. The battery won't start the engines. So we need to get that turned on. Once it's turned on, you should hear it come online. Now we can turn on the APU generator, which will take power from the turbine stage, and it charges the battery and feeds electricity to the electricity bus. So it's really helping the battery out. At this point, you can turn on the inverters and check your avionics, your gauges, and test your annunciators to make sure that's all working. You can also set your backup attitude indicator so that the indicator is level for whatever your preferred viewing angle is. You can also turn on and check your anti-ice systems. There's a portion of the primary flight display that will indicate whether or not those ice systems are on and working. So if you're not flying in icing conditions, you can just keep them turned off. Another checklist item is the emergency float system, which you can't really test in the simulator short of actually turning them on, which will inflate the floats on the outside of the helicopter, which in real life you wouldn't want to do. But for our case, we can just test flipping up the little protective switch that protects you from accidentally hitting the button. Just making sure that works and just taking note of where that button is located should it become necessary to push it while you're in flight. What you can also do at this point is just move the controls around, make sure they're free and correct so that they're responding to your control stick or whatever system you're using to control the helicopter's flight controls. You can look around and make sure that the helicopter is responding the way that you're expecting it to and that it really should. What we can do now is set our radios, just check them out, make sure that everything's working there. We can enter frequencies that we know we're going to use. So the way it works is there's one knob on each of the radios. So to control the comm side or the nav side, you have to select these little buttons that will tell the knob to affect that particular radio. The exact same principle applies for the second radio. It's just on the other side of the cockpit. There's also a radio ICS panel that's on the outer side wall of the cockpit. This allows you to control which of the radios you want to broadcast with, so you can transmit either on the active COM 1 or COM 2 frequency. By default, the COM receive switch will copy whatever transmit radio you choose. But once you do that, you can then go back and adjust it. So if you want to listen to both COM 1 and COM 2, just COM 2, or none of them at all, you can click these switches here and make that happen. So at this point in the flight or the pre-flight, you could listen into the weather, file your flight plan, and just do things like that before you get the main engine started and really start burning through your fuel. So moving on, the nav source panel on the center console is what allows you to choose which nav radio, nav 1, nav 2, or the FMS you would like to feed the moving map, the HSI, or the localizer and glide slope for the autopilot. So now we want to confirm that the autopilot is off. The servos aren't coupled. The flight director is not going to try to control the aircraft when the rotor starts spinning. So we just want to make sure that's off. You can click these buttons here on the center console to ensure that happens. And the screen in the AFCS panel, which is the Automatic Flight Control System panel, shouldn't say FD or Flight Director on, and it shouldn't say Autopilot coupled. If it doesn't say those things, then they're off and you're in the clear. So at this point, we can flip on the anti-collision lights, which lets people, ground crew, or whoever is outside know that you're about to fire up the main engines. Now we're going to want to set the bleed air mode to auxiliary power unit. So by default, the bleed air switch should already be up towards APU. If for some reason it's not, and it's on one of the lower settings, which are for the engines, just make sure it's flipped up to APU. Now you'll want to ensure that the governor is off using this switch here on the overhead panel, and you'll want to slide the throttle handles to idle if they're not already there. Now in the real S-92, there's not a governor switch. The throttle handles actually engage what is essentially the governor if you move them forward to the fly position. But for the purposes of making everything work in X-Plane, you really need to have a governor. So that's why there's a governor switch there. Now you set the fuel mode to direct per engine. There's one toggle switch for each engine. This is different than the start procedure for smaller, more traditional turbine engines due to the S-92's FADEC, which controls the introduction of the fuel in the startup process and helps to avoid hot starts and issues like that, and really just makes the whole process more simple. Now you'll need to find the igniter switches, which are located just aft of the throttle controls. You want to turn them on. What the igniters do are basically like what the spark does if you have a gas stove. It starts the fire, otherwise you're just shooting fuel into the combustion chamber of the engine. it's time to engage the starters. Press and hold the number 1 engine starter first. You'll hear the starter engage, and just keep holding that button until the fuel introduction sound happens, which is kind of a low rumbling noise. And you can look down at the MFD, multifunction display, to make sure that N1, which is the compressor stage, is spinning. So if it's at 0%, then that's a problem. Now, you can also look through the window in the ceiling and make sure that the rotors start spinning, which they should. Now we repeat that process for engine number 2. We make sure that the number 2 igniters are on and that the fuel to the number 2 engine is set to direct. Throttle is at idle. Governor is off. We press and hold the starter. We'll hear it start. Once the fuel intro sound happens, we hear that rumble. We can let go, look down and check and make sure that the N1 is moving up and the temperature is staying at a reasonable level. This is also a good time to double check your fuel status if you haven't. You want to make sure you have enough to safely get to where you're going. And at this point we can let the passengers know that we're very close to taking off. You can turn on the fasten seatbelt signs using the switches here on the side part of the overhead panel just above where the right seat pilot is sitting. You can also turn on the no smoking sign if you don't want your passengers to be smoking and filling up the cabin with smoke. You can also turn on the cabin overhead lights for them if it's getting dark. You can give them reading lights. Now you can also set the cabin temperature to make it comfortable for your passengers. Now currently these manipulators are a little bit finicky depending on where the temperature control knobs are facing. It's just an issue with the axis that X-Plane uses to define how the rotation should occur. And that's something I'm working on fixing for future updates. But for right now, you can sort of figure out if you move the mouse, the knob will move in some kind of associated way. And you can set the heat, air conditioner, vent system, all of that to your desired settings. So at this point, finally, we're getting close to actually flying. What we want to do is click on the governor, and you'll notice the throttle handles will automatically start moving up towards fly. Now, when the throttles go up to fly, it'll probably go past 100% RPM for a moment and then come back down. So you'll see those handles moving, and what they're doing is just responding to basically commands from the governor, which is telling the engines what to do to keep the rotor spinning at 100% rotor RPM. So, looking down at the multifunction display, we should see that our rotor RPM is indeed settling at 100% RPM. We can also take a look outside and see that the rotors are spinning fast now. They should be a blurry disk, and it should sound like you're at 100% power as well. The next item on the checklist is the transponder, which really should have been set up already, but you want to make sure that it is running at this point. When you get your clearance from ATC, if you're filing an instrument flight plan, they should provide you with a transponder code. So you want to make sure that that code is entered into the transponder, and you want to set it to on or alt. You don't just want it to be on standby. You want to turn it all the way to on, which will report your code to air traffic controllers along with your altitude. If you're just flying VFR, you can just push this button here labeled VFR, and it will automatically enter the code 1200 into your transponder for you. Now set your exterior lights as required, and in the search and rescue model you also have a night sun searchlight, which you really don't need to turn on while you're taking off. It's really for finding people in the ocean or wherever they may be. But just as a point in talking about the lights right now, we can mention that in X-Plane 10, the light will actually cast a pool of light on the terrain and scenery, but only if the landing lights are off. So the way X-Plane works is it can only show a generated pool of light from one source. It can either be the landing lights or, in this case, the searchlight. So only one will work at a time. So if you don't see the beam hitting the ground from the searchlight, it's probably because the landing lights are on. In X-Plane 9, you can't really see the beam of light being generated. That's really a feature that was enabled in X-Plane 10. If it's raining outside, at this point you can also turn on the wipers because we're about to take off. So we can disengage the parking brake and be ready on the controls. Now the way an S-92 is designed, the main rotor system is actually angled forward slightly. This helps it cruise at a fast speed while staying relatively level to the ground, so that the fuselage is parallel to the ground basically while you're cruising at high speed. The challenge that creates on the ground, though, is that the thrust and downwash and lift being generated by your main rotors is angled when you're sitting on the ground forwards. So if you just start pulling pitch, you're going to start going forwards, which is perfectly fine if you're trying to taxi along the ground, but if it's not your intention, then you don't want to be doing that. And we'll cover ground taxiing and some other procedures in future tutorials. So for right now, to take off, what you really need to do is raise the nose by using the cyclic control, which is your yoke, your control stick, whatever it is you're using. You need to pull back ever so slightly as you pull pitch to lift the nose up, and that'll prevent you from rolling forwards. You want to lift the nose to about a 4-degree angle, and that'll prevent you from rolling forwards or backwards. If you go beyond about 4 degrees and you have the brakes off, you could start rolling backwards, and that's not always a good idea. It's hard to see what's behind you, and the S-92 is a pretty large helicopter that's about 60 feet long, so it's just a bad idea to back up without being able to see what's behind you. In any case, let's try to get that 4-degree nose-high angle, and you can actually use the forward no panel view with the heads-up display to help you, especially if this is your first time flying the helicopter, an X-plane, or flying the S-92 for that matter. This can help you just make sure you have that 4 degrees nose-high angle, and having the panel disappear gives you more visual references that'll make it easier for you to hold a hover. That's really, I mean, you might say that's cheating, but as we're learning, it's fine to cheat because we're really trying to just get a handle on how this thing works. Once you start to get familiar with how the aircraft responds to your inputs and how it flies, it's easier to just stay in the normal 3D cockpit. But at this point, we really want to try to familiarize ourselves with how the aircraft is going to act and respond. So, as you pull pitch with the collective, you'll start to yaw to the right as a result of the torque, which is the force that's spinning the blades. It's spinning the blades at a high rate of speed, but as soon as those wheels come off the ground or start to come off the ground, it's going to want to start spinning you and the fuselage the opposite direction. So we need to use the rudder pedals, which control the tail rotor, to prevent that from happening. So we want to enter a little bit of left rudder as we pull pitch, and really the best way to do this is to pull it in little increments. So add a little bit of collective. You'll see something start to happen, whether it's yawing to the right or yawing to the left or rolling forward or rolling back, and then just enter the control inputs with the cyclic or the rudder pedals that are necessary to stop whatever that movement is from happening, and then pull a little bit more pitch. It's a lot easier that way to take off in a stable way. Flying the helicopter is really just an exercise in anticipation. Once you enter a situation where you're reacting to try to catch up with what the helicopter is doing, it's kind of a bad situation. So taking it slowly now will really help you get a sense and a feel for how the helicopter acts based on what you tell it to do, so you can start to anticipate what will happen. So for example, if we're in the hover kind of moving ahead here, and the helicopter begins to pitch down, experience will tell you that you're going to start accelerating in that direction. It won't happen instantaneously, but it's going to happen. So you really need to develop that experience to be able to anticipate what's going to happen based on what your attitude is in the hover or in the liftoff procedure. So it's something that takes practice. It takes practice in real life, and it takes practice in the simulator. But that's should be where the challenge and the fun of this whole thing is learning how to develop that skill and really honing it until you're good at it, and you can really have the helicopter doing whatever you want it to. So back to the process of lifting off. One other little wrinkle that you'll run into is kind of an adverse lateral movement that will happen, and that's a result of the tail rotor, and it's producing a lot of thrust to stop you from spinning, but that thrust is actually pushing you to the right as well. If you're fighting the torque, it's going to be pushing you, the whole aircraft, slightly to the right. So to counteract that, you need to roll ever so slightly to the left. So it's almost like cocking your head slightly to the side. That's what it'll sort of feel like in the helicopter. You need to kind of roll it a little bit to the left, and that'll prevent you from translating laterally to the right. Again, if you do this slowly, it takes practice, but if you do it slowly, you will soon be able to pull yourself up into a nice stable hover. And that is the hardest part of flying this helicopter or any helicopter. So once you master that, then I guess I can't say that's all there is to it, but that's as far as mastering the physical challenge of physically manipulating the controls and keeping the thing under control. That's really all there is to it in that sense. So once you're in a stable hover, you're probably going to want to enter forward flight, which in an airplane is just as simple as pushing the throttle forward and lifting off when you reach a prescribed airspeed. But in a helicopter, the throttle is only spinning the rotors. There's no thrust being generated necessarily by the engines. All they're doing is providing torque force to make the rotor spin. So what you need to do is vector the thrust and the lift that's being generated by that rotor where you want to go. And how we do that is by using the cyclic to pitch forward in the direction that we want to go. This will begin to accelerate the aircraft, and as the aircraft accelerates, it will start to behave more and more like an airplane, which is a more stable flying condition. It's easier to fly, and as you come out of ground effect and through effective translational lift, which is fresh air entering the rotor system, that actually helps improve performance, and it just becomes a lot easier to fly when you're in forward flight. Now, X-Plane does a really good job at replicating the behavior of a real helicopter, and that's something I've always appreciated about X-Plane. So one thing you'll notice, especially if this is your first time flying a helicopter in X-Plane, is that you need to apply gentle control inputs. Just as you can start falling behind what the helicopter is doing if you're unable to anticipate what's about to happen, you can also fall behind in the sense that you apply too much control input and then have to apply an equal or greater drastic control input to stop whatever attitude or flight condition you incited, basically, and you just enter this kind of crazy oscillating chain of events that tends to result in disaster. But when you learn to just use gentle control inputs and really know how to anticipate what needs to happen in order for the flight condition you want to happen, then it's not unrecoverable. You can regain control. But again, that takes time. Okay, so in forward flight, everything's pretty stable and more or less easy to control in forward flight. You just want to make sure that using the rudder pedals and the tail rotor, you keep yourself coordinated just as you would with the tail rudder in a fixed wing airplane, to keep yourself coordinated so that you're always pointed into the relative wind. The next big challenge is stopping, basically, coming out of forward flight. You've reached your destination and you want to land. So that's another challenge all its own. As long as you're not just dropping straight down like you would in an elevator, you're going to be having fresh air going through your rotor system. You also don't want to be making downwind approaches. That's another matter, I guess, that we can discuss in a future tutorial. But in simple terms, as long as you're moving forward into fresh air as you're descending, and descending at a reasonable rate, you'll be able to arrest that descent at the bottom by pulling pitch on the collective and then balancing everything out with the cyclic. And that's really it as a matter of principle. Of course, in practice, that takes time to learn how to master those techniques. And again, using the forward no panel view can be really helpful by giving you a greater view of visual references that are really going to help you be able to recognize what's happening around you. As far as this tutorial is concerned, I think we've covered a lot. Hopefully I've done it in a way that's been clear enough and tolerable enough to kind of follow and take something away from. And there's more things that we can certainly explore in future tutorials. We can talk more about techniques like landing on oil platforms, landing on the ships. We can explore more of the emergency situations, like doing an engine failure where you have to enter an auto rotation or deploy the floats and ditch in the water. There's a lot more stuff that we can explore and learn. I just thought we would begin with the basics so that everybody can enjoy flying the S-92 in sort of normal conditions. And then from there we can move on to the more advanced, unorthodox type of situations that you might encounter. If you have any comments or questions, please post them. And any ideas or requests for topics to cover in the future tutorials, let me know. If you even want future tutorials, or if this has been such an unsavory experience, if you want me to stop, just let me know. But again, I do hope you've enjoyed watching and listening, and hopefully you have some stuff to practice now in X-Plane.